If you don't remember anything from your CCNA routing and switching, or if you did not take CCNA routing and switching, there are a few things you need to brush up on, because for wireless, although it's wireless, there are a few things we use from the switching side of things that needs to be familiar to you to take the CCNA wireless exam and to work comfortably with access points and controllers. One concept, of course, is a switch. You should know what a switch is. And also VLANs. And if you don't remember, a VLAN is a way at layer 2, at switching layer, to isolate devices from one another. On the same switch, you can define, for example, one port to be in VLAN 2, another port to be in VLAN 5, and although these two devices connect to the same switch, just by the virtue of the fact that they are in different VLANs, they cannot communicate directly to each other at layer 2. So by creating VLANs, you create isolation at layer 2. If you want to communicate from that device in VLAN 2 to device in VLAN 5, then you need to climb up one layer and go at layer 3. And that means that you need a router that is going to be able to communicate from one device to the other above the VLANs, because you're going to use IP to communicate. Typically, and that's what you should do, you associate a VLAN to a layer 3 subnet. And because different VLANs represent different layer 3 subnets, the router is going to be able to route packets from one VLAN to the other, because it routes packets from one subnet to the other. When you configure your switch, you would put a port to VLAN 2 in what we call access mode, where basically the device connecting to that switch, the laptop in that case, does not even know that it is in VLAN. And then, of course, you will allow all the VLANs on the way to the router, because this one needs to see everybody and needs to see all the VLANs. This mode is called a trunk. And you can define which VLANs are allowed on that trunk, everything or just some of them. Access mode, trunk mode, VLAN is something you should know for the CCNA wireless exam. Now, this topology where you have this router connecting to the switch is what we used to call a router on a stick. It's not a real stick, right? It's just a cable going to the switch, but that's what the topology looks like. Now, that was in the days where switches were only layer 2 devices. But then came the days where switches could also route. You could also have a routing function inside a switch, and they became what we call layer 3 switches. They can switch and they can route. So you can get rid of the router on the stick because the routing function is already inside the switch, and that's the icon you see at the bottom. As long as your ports on that switch are in access mode or in trunk mode, those are what we call switched ports. But because it's also a router, you can also disable the switching function of some of the ports and say you are directly a routed port. You don't understand VLANs, you just communicate using IP. When you configure switches for access points and controller communication, you would typically put your access switches in an access port. And then your controller will often be on the trunk. And the reason why is because the controller is going to have VLANs that are going to be configured on that controller. And that's to send various types of traffic. And because that traffic may need to be isolated, you need to have different VLANs on the controller. So all this controller traffic needs to get to the switch, so the port to the controller needs to be a trunk. Access points do not have these VLAN requirements, so they are typically in an access mode, unless they are in very specific mode, because they are autonomous and they support VLANs, or because they are in Flex Connect mode. We'll come back on those. But most of the time, access points connected to a controller will be in access mode.